All right. So in January of 2004, I was teaching at a college called Hartwick College in upstate New York, and we had a January term, so a term where students would do a single intensive course for the whole of the month. And because the New Hampshire primary was conveniently located on the calendar at the very end of January, a colleague and I decided to build a course that would immerse students in the primary. So we took 20 students to New Hampshire for the month, and all of the students did a few things. They worked on a campaign of their choice. They participated in a seminar, which was, that part of it looked like a typical college course. We met a couple mornings a week. They read literature on presidential campaigns and elections. We discussed it. Students made presentations, etc. And then we took every opportunity to find the candidates where they were on the campaign trail. So during January of a presidential year, New Hampshire is just full of presidential candidates. They give stump speeches at bowling alleys and in high school gyms, and they walk through diners and coffee shops, and they shake hands with people, and they're on the streets in every town, and they publish calendars that tell the media where they're going to be every day so you can get on that list, and you just go and find them and participate. And our students got to ask candidates questions at forums, and they got to approach them after they gave a talk and interact one-on-one. And all sorts of things happened that we didn't know would happen. So students developed levels of confidence in doing practical work that we didn't expect because it's such an intensified calendar. Being there for like 3 weeks every day makes you suddenly a senior member of the campaign team, and our students were being handed responsibility at levels I wouldn't have predicted. They were precinct captains on primary day, and they were really in the thick of things. And we had an experience right afterward where we went to a panel at the Kennedy School at Harvard the day after the primary, and it came up in the question and answer that our students had been doing this work, and all of a sudden these experts on the panel, Harvard faculty and well-known journalists, were starting to ask all of our students these questions. And what did you experience in terms of how, working class voters were responding to the various candidates? And our students were speaking in a way that demonstrated a real depth of understanding of what they've been doing. And one of the reasons that I got excited from that experience was that students who had not been the greatest students in doing the traditional classroom activities, maybe weren't the strongest writers or the ones who did the best on an exam, some of them were the strongest in this domain. They discovered they had capacities they didn't know about, and it gave them the confidence to tell people about their experiences and to write about it in ways that were much stronger than what they'd been able to do coming in the front door. And for me, there was a kind of deeper lesson about teaching that I think about in terms of a kind of risk-reward ratio, that when you get out of the classroom, when you turn over control to the world, the realities around you, instead of having yourself frame it. You're dealing with snowstorms and ice storms in January in New Hampshire. You're dealing with one day a student is volunteering for a campaign. The next day that candidate pulls out of the race, and you have to figure out now what are you going to do with that student. So there's all kinds of things. You're dealing with, that was the year that Howard Dean had the famous scream in Iowa in the middle of our time there, and our students on the Dean campaign were all crying because they were so upset that this was all falling apart around them. And we responded to that, and we found that the depth of our students' learning was just dramatically different from what it otherwise would have been, even in the best classroom teaching. And we did some research on this experience. So we had done a lot of pre-testing with students. We did post-testing, including follow-up significantly later. And we found that we were right, that the impact was significant and shaped their choices about majors and summer internship experiences. And because I've stayed in touch with a lot of these students, I know it's also had an impact on career choices. Many of these students are involved in public life. And we did, comparison groups of other political science majors and national samples of political science students, and they look different from those students. And again, if you'd been there, that would be no surprise, because it was a really kind of intensive, exciting experience. So it's not always possible to do that, because that's a really distinctive opportunity. But I've been focused ever since on trying to find ways to capture some of that magic, even in small ways, in other kinds of courses, both inside and outside the classroom.
So what would you recommend as the very first perhaps small step if a faculty member wanted to capture some of that magic, and they also wanted to get some rewards beyond the magic, which might be, as you alluded to, something to publish or some sort of research in their field. So what are some of the ways in which they can begin to think differently as they review their courses each term?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, one thing is think about what are experiences I could frame that would contribute to students learning the things I want them to learn. So, if you're teaching about certain contexts out there in the real world, would it help to have students have a way to be in that setting? And then what are some ways that could happen that would not make your students kind of a drag and getting in the way, but maybe contributing to the goals that an organization or an institution or a community has? Because if you put students in a place but they don't have a role there, it's really hard for them to get a feel for it, and it's hard for anything real to happen. If you put them in a place where they do have a role, then all of a sudden they can really be part of the mix and get a feel for what's going on. So, again, very often there's somebody on a campus who can help you facilitate that, but finding out, if I'm teaching about, what's going on in communities of certain kinds, well, where do those communities gather, and what are the opportunities, social institutions, schools, community organizations, whatever it might be, where maybe my students can play a role. So, I also think, you can get some of it going on through simulations and things like that in certain kinds of courses. I always did court simulations when I taught about the courts, but actually getting students in real-world settings gives them just a different relationship to the material. The other thing about it that is, I think all of us, when we teach, we want our students to care about what we're teaching them, right? That's what you always hope for. And when what students are learning is connected to real people, their real lives, their real goals, then they are very likely to care. And that changes everything else about the course. So even if it is a discrete experience, but now everything you're teaching is connected to the people we met in a particular place doing a particular thing, that will change your experience of teaching and your students' experience of learning.
And you also made mention about evaluations and pre-surveys and post-surveys. But if I am in a particular field, I'm thinking, well, how do you grade magic? Well, maybe you know it when you see it, but what is a more comfortable or more concrete way of evaluating students' performance when what you're witnessing you can really only describe as really great?
Right. So, one of the things is, I would always say some of it is do some of the traditional stuff. So our students, at the end of that term, the paper they all had to write was analyzing the degree to which the events that they had just witnessed, participated in, experienced, conform to what they would have expected based on the literature about presidential primary campaigns. So that's a pretty traditional activity, but it made them connect that experience and approach it in an analytic way, and take things that they had seen. All of a sudden, they realized that what data is, or data are, or however we say that, data are the results of human beings observing things. And suddenly they had done the observing, and we were saying, okay, scholars have observed other things. Now you observe this very close up in a very intensive way. How does it fit or not fit with what you would predict based on what scholars have said? So that was one way. We also, and in other things I've done, I always have students write about what they're experiencing, but not in a strictly in a sort of personal way. Sometimes that's part of it, because I do think it's very important when you're putting students in complex situations where they might encounter, especially if it's things that are potentially upsetting or whatever, that you have a way to kind of monitor how they're doing in that way, so that if things are coming up that you need to deal with, you can be on top of that. But for the kind of learning purposes of the course, it's important that students know they're not just there to have fun or do good or whatever it is. They're there to observe, to analyze, to interpret, to try to make sense of the complexities of the world in the ways that we're trying to cultivate through a college education. And all of that becomes powerful material for you to understand the degree to which they are intellectually engaged and they are learning and they are developing the capacity to put things together. I mean, from my perspective, so for example, in setting students, I've often had working in community-based organizations that are dealing with poverty-related issues, and then they're reading materials about that, about the growth of inequality in the United States, or we've had students read in a course called Making Social Change, Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Nickel and Dimed. Then all of the reflective writing they do, they are required to engage with those materials in the way they talk about their experience. Are they seeing things, again, that lines up with what they've read about? Are they seeing things that it seems like is undetected by the scholarly or journalistic writing that they've read? And from my perspective, that's what we want students to be able to do, is to start taking ideas that they're gathering from others and then testing those against the realities of the world, as well as being able to make sense of the realities of the world through frameworks that they have encountered in literature, in disciplines, or again in serious journalistic writing or whatever it is. And these opportunities just create marvelous opportunities for that. Then there are also opportunities for faculty to take their own analytic capacities and train it on these experiences and say, what can we learn about student learning, also about the substantive issues that the students are engaging with, by framing these experiences and seeing what happens, right? So faculty can put themselves in the position of researchers with respect to their students, and that's another powerful dimension. That's what we often call the scholarship of engagement. And again, a serious literature is developing that really helps us understand a lot about teaching, both in those settings and I think more broadly, because again, I think some of the tools then become things you can figure out other ways to apply. And there are opportunities for thinking about some basic social issues, about confrontations across lines of difference, about the relationship between different communities and big social institutions like colleges and universities. So there's a lot of issues that swirl around that can become occasions for scholarly analysis and research by faculty.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.